This is the Real Social Environment Lunchtime Conversation daily at 1 p.m. I'm your host, Phong Bui. Very excited today. We are welcoming Paul Miller, known also as Dr. DJ. I should want to call him Dr. Cookie. That's Subliminal Kid. Paul is an electronic and experimental hip-hop musician, composer. I would say that he's also a producer, a writer, philosopher, author, artist. I think we met maybe 6.5 years ago at Robert Mueller when you have the show there, Paul. Mm-hmm. It's been a while, but I'm so happy to have you here with us today, talking about a lot of things. But one thing I'd like to begin is one of the things about the Real interview that very much on everybody's mind, particularly for younger people, my graduate student and younger artists, is anything for other people too. I mean, from who not even interested in the art world and whatnot, are interested. How do we undertake? You know, how do the artists begin? He or she or they discover what they love, and how do they mobilize that to reach maturity? That journey is what makes the Real interview so invaluable, you know? Mm-hmm. So, as you know, art doesn't get better. You know, art doesn't quite make progress like science, but what it does is that it reveals the unfiltered truth that speaks about everything else going on in our world, you know, beauty in a variety of ways, but definitely inner freedom. So let's begin a little bit of your early formation. I know that your dad was a lawyer, taught at Howard University, and you inherit a serious record collection from him. That's how your love for music began. Am I right? Can you just
that's sure. I mean, let's break that into two sections. One, the current moment, because the current moment, I feel like the normal physical arts of the painting, sculpture, etc., they're being under radical critique right now because everything is going to be more and more, I believe at least, anything that can be digital will be digital. So we have to really rethink the role of the arts in reshaping how the public imagination works. And so for me as an artist, DJing was a perfect metaphor for that because it's a collage-based, appropriation-oriented technique. So you're always taking fragments and reshaping them into kind of a moving work, whatever that work is. So when I say moving, meaning like the moving parts of a sort of abstract machine. Okay, yeah. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., and to go back to the other part of your question, I grew up in D.C., which had a really amazing scene of punk, reggae, dub, a lot of political musicians. I don't know if you know the band Bad Brains or Fugazi. They're big influences on my thinking and my music. But on the other end of the spectrum, my family, both parents were professors. My father was dean of Howard University's law school, and my mother was a historian of design. So growing up in DC in the Reagan era was always, one of those weird paradoxical times because there was political music, political art, amazing stuff happening, but you're a kid. So that stuff kind of lingers over the dialogue. But then you realize also you have this really right-wing narrative going on with Reagan. Mm-hmm. And when he first took office, the first thing he did was take off the solar panels on the White House. And I always found that paradoxical and strange because when you're a kid, that looked cool and futuristic and interesting. So Jimmy Carter had put these solar panels on top of the White House and had kind of used that as a way of saying renewable energy was going to be a future narrative. And Reagan kind of stopped that and then just locked it down and pulled the panels off and said, let's go more oil. Yeah. So I'm just using that as a kind of a context for our 21st century moment where we have the legacy of all these irresponsible policies now that have just gone into a huge, for lack of a word, like toxic cocktail of climate change, denial, failed policies of science, not thinking about the political economy of how people are looking at renewable resources. And above all, what is resilience in this time of, total upheaval? I mean, the corona stuff is going to reshape a lot of things. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a comprehensive idea. Most of that still deals with the arts, but it's publicly accessible in a way that gives people the sense that art is a tool for reimagining the world around you.
Yeah.
I think a lot of artists right now are recovering from the art market of like the whole art fair thing and stuff like that, which to me is like a shopping mall for the 1%. And the whole art fair thing has radically changed how people think about public space in the arts, at least, because it's so commercial and so slick. And so to me, I find it very annoying. So those are three things that I kind of wanted to riff with you about, is the changing public discourse right now because of the virus issues, and how that we have to reimagine public space.
Okay, that sounds super fair. But tell us a little bit more about your notion or idea of what an artist do with visual sampling in your own history from the get-go.
Okay,
that's what.
Let's call up one of the first slide. If the audience can see, that's a slide of me DJing with Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka is a legendary poet, and out of the kind of the beat poetry scene. And a lot of my work comes out of that kind of critique of how language and the poetry of that time is now migrated to code. One could argue we're in this sort of collision of code and culture right now. When I mean code, meaning all the codes driving the web, the algorithms, the equations, all of those things that make the internet functional, they actually reach deep into the heart of contemporary culture. I mean, we're a data-driven society. So to look at Amiri Baraka, him and Allen Ginsberg, when I was a kid growing up, I really looked up to them quite a bit. And my favorite of all of them was William S. Burroughs. So Burroughs had a book called Nova Express, where I took my nickname from that. It's called The Subliminal Kid. So hopefully that'll give you guys a little bit of context. And the Baraka, I did the first DJ mixes with him. He's a legendary figure for African-American poetry, but also just rethinking the political landscape of language. I think he was really, really important figure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, he was one of the few African-American, maybe with few exceptions, like Ishmael Reed from the East. But yes, I did manage to meet him a few times. And with Williamsboro too, at Francesco Clemente. They were with all these people. But that's the whole, scene of so-called counterculture is that why people like ourselves have read and heard about in college. And what we're doing is try to recreate that scene without being nostalgic, really, But tell more about, the idea of how you came to understand your capacity, to cross-pollinate all the things that you do. At what age, at what period in your life that you realize you can undertake all of this? Because it's so anti-established idea of what the model for success is, Paul?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't fit in the normal art world box. And to be honest, I have no interest in the normal art world box. Most people are just trying to hustle, meet some curators, go to the right dinner party, and sell some work. It sounds about the bulk of a lot of artists these days. But to me at least, the critical issue right now is that we need to rethink social space, as a basic premise for change. Capitalism, many of the issues that there's a really good visual essay Naomi Klein just did recently with The Intercept. The Intercept uses my music for their podcast, for example. When you say counterculture, I'm a big fan of giving people better tools to think for critical thinking. So DJing, when I first started out, it was meant to be an art project. I never thought it was going to be a popular oriented approach. To this day, I'm always surprised that, I've been DJing globally, pretty much all over the world, large scale events. I know that's shocking to some people in New York, but New York is not the epicenter of these things. You go to Beijing, you go to Seoul, Berlin, Tokyo, London. New York right now is it's in a holding pattern. I think there's a lot of great stuff happening, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was really fascinating. There was a moment where electronic music was the defining kind of transition out of the counterculture of rock. So most people thought of Sonic Youth, all these kinds of art rock bands. And then the artists that were associated with them, for example, Tony Orsler, I'm sure you know Tony. There was never a moment where the art world would let hip hop in, and it was always like a struggle to get the sound art. I'm using air quotes, sound art, because they feared beats. They would never let a beat in. They always had Christian Marclay, broken records, whatever. I'm not against Christian, not really for Christian either, but I always felt that there was a struggle to get the art world to deal with beats. And so now, of course, the world and the landscape has changed. Electronic music has now become the global dominant vocabulary. It's just not, in the normal art world still has, you know, weird issues about that. But, you know, these are times where you have to have a kind of a sense of evolution of form. And that's, if we can go to the next slide, by the way, I'll just show you that really quick.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so Phong, when we were talking earlier about narrative and propaganda and all these things, D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation in 1915 kind of set the tone for how cinema would be used to manipulate public opinion.
Absolutely.
How do you feel? I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the art of perception, because that's where cinema and the visual arts really, you know, when I, you know, think about, for example, Leni Riefenstahl, Sergei Eisenstein, you know, every nation state of the early 20th century was trying to figure this stuff out. And Griffith really somehow got the formula together. What do you think?
No, I think that was part of what they want to mobilize film. I think there seem to be two groups of kind of filmmaking. One is exactly about propaganda, and the other people who were trying to make film, thinking of it, perceiving it as an art form, you know? So we know that there's always two seemingly different model here. But this was very controversial, as we know. It might have appeared in the first issue of Film Culture magazine, when it started it in 1953, I think. Yeah, we know that. But the point is that how did this thing come about? You undertake this huge project.
Well, let's unpack that for a second, because even right now, as we speak, the narrative of the coronavirus has been already propagandized. So if you look at what the Chinese government has been doing versus the American government, you know, versus what's happening in Europe, you know, if you go back to 1915 through about 1918, I'm going to do a little drum roll here. Guess what the other phenomenon was of course, the Spanish influenza. Now, at that same time, President Woodrow Wilson was intervening in the European first, you know, World War I. He created the Creel Commission for Public Information, and his favorite filmmaker was D.W. Griffith. So amusing enough, he commissioned Griffith to do these war propaganda reels, and Griffith actually even went to some of the front lines of World War I and to document it and to make it more cinematic looking to help recruit people. Their most famous poster that comes out of that graphic design was the "I Want You" for the U.S. Army. I'm sure you've seen that Uncle Sam pointing at you, "I want you." And that actually influenced people like Andy Warhol later and so on. But the fun part about that kind of strange toxic cocktail of World War I, the Spanish influenza, and then on the other end of the spectrum, how film became a sort of a beginning of a nation state discourse. The virus at that time, we're almost at the 100th anniversary. We just passed it actually of the influenza. And now, of course, coronavirus is just on the turn of the century, from 100 years ago till now. We have another reshaping of public space and public discourse. And the world is moving much more into a digital context. Everyone is in this sort of quarantine lifestyle. But to tie that to Griffith, what ended up happening with Griffith is that he's considered to be the person who invented Hollywood and the DNA of Hollywood. For me, I wanted to kind of interrogate that, pull it apart, and then remix it. So the most major concert of that was we had it projected at the Acropolis in Greece, and we had about 5,000 people come out for that. It was really an amazing event. So these are all things that as we struggle with this transition from physical space to digital space, this whole coronavirus thing it's much more an eerie relationship to both ecosystems and then the mental ecosystems or psychological ecosystems, because we have to redefine self and subject as we move further into this. I think this phenomena there's not going to be a new normal. I mean, it's really going to be very William S. Burroughs, very Ishmael Reed, et cetera, kind of landscape. Viruses, if you look at William S. Burroughs' novels, he always says viruses and language is a virus, and that was one of his most famous phrases. But anyway, to make the long story short, that still ties in with some of the issues that Griffiths was thinking about. Because memes, for example, are the legacy of that, and the way that people on stuff like TikTok or the larger social media platforms like Instagram, all those are a flattening of social space into an image sequence. You know, if you think about memes, GIFs, and so on. And I'm a big fan of Lev Manovich's, The Language of New Media. It's a great book.
Yeah.
So, yeah, anyway, I just wanted to show you that slide, and then we can transition to the next one too.
I appreciate the comment and this collaboration that you did there with Chronos Quartet, but just on the tail end, continuing to the idea of propaganda, I mean, something that perpetuate even in the subconscious level. I mean, when you mentioned coming of age during the Reaganite period, that's when I came to New York, essentially. Walking in A Street, I remember the poster of Ronald Reagan head being photoshopped, probably the first good Photoshop work ever done, poster head on top of Rambo, you know what I mean?
Okay.
Body with the machine gun. That was
right.
In what's going to happen in Nicaragua, I remember very clearly. But it was also the same time, now that I remember clearly, when Platoon came out, in the end, when Willem Dafoe played the good soldier that trying to come in the very end, and he got shot. Remember
Sure. It's a classic, yeah.
Classic, and you remember the sequence of how slow it was. In slow motion, he was being shot and his hand extended out as a foundation of a crucifixion of Jesus. That he was asked to be playing in Last Temptation of Christ with Scorsese. It's amazing. We know that it's been perpetuated and retooled, redeployed in Hollywood film particularly. But going forward, now that you show us this image here, is this eyes?
Yeah. So let's unpack what you were just talking about, because Willem Dafoe helped start the Worcester group, and I live in Tribeca, and I always walk past their garage. It's a great spot. Yeah. But the theater of that, when you talk about Reagan and Photoshop, amusingly enough, Reagan was, of course, an actor, before he was the president. And so too with our current Trump administration, like Steve Bannon, for example, was a producer of really bad documentaries. Steve Mnuchin, most of the major people in the Trump administration come out of reality TV and or documentaries. And so the manipulation of public opinion following 100 years since the President Woodrow Wilson set up the Ministry of Public Information, the web has now become the forum for that. So amusingly enough, I'm a huge Willem Dafoe fan. He's an amazing actor. And again, Tribeca, there's a whole bunch of people. He lives around here, Harvey Keitel or Cindy Sherman. There's a great group of people here. There's a wonderful composer who lives next door to me, Laurie Spiegel as well. She does a lot. In terms of women in electronic music, she's a legendary figure. But to go to the photograph at hand, that's me when I took a studio to Antarctica and did a series of what I call acoustic portraits of ice. To me, at least, we have to really think about the notion of impermanence right now. And ice is a perfect metaphor for that, because it transitions between mediums. But at the same time, water is one of the major components of our bodies. So the fun thing about going to Antarctica as well is it's the only place on Earth with no government. And the whole sensibility of this notion of art is usually a response to kind of context and confrontation with content. So the triple C. With Antarctica, what I'd wanted to do was do kind of a series of initiatives around the sort of mathematics of climate change. So I worked with a very renowned mathematician and quantum physicist, Brian Greene. Brian wrote a book called The Elegant Universe, which was a big inspiration for me. And he has a new book right now on the end of time. But he's probably one of the world's leading sort of experimental physicists. So he wrote the introduction to my book that I wrote in Antarctica. And then I took Johannes Kepler's equations. Johannes Kepler wrote a series of essays and equations called Six Sides of a Snowflake. And those are generally considered to be the first mathematical treatise on math and nature. Now, even if you go to like ancient sort of earlier Greek stuff like the triangle, for example, or looking at Pythagoras and the tuning of the universe, ice is still kind of the foundational platform for thinking around that, especially with Kepler and Galileo. So the fun part about 2020 right now is that we're in a data-driven society. There's no question about it. Oh, I just saw Timothy Morton joined us. He's a wonderful writer who has a book. Yeah, he's awesome. So, when you think about art and design and the language of how people think about physical space and nature, those kind of things can be very powerful tools for change. That's where we can kind of think of climate denial as some sort of suspension where people are reading the wrong script for the wrong movie theater or something. I don't know how to the eerie sensibility of climate denial is that the legacy of the fossil fuel industry and manipulation of opinion for decades. I mean, there's article after article that shows the major fossil fuel corporations funneled millions of dollars into changing public perception. Even the term public relations that was coined by Sigmund Freud's nephew, it's kind of a hilarious moment. But the eerie thing about how that works is that nature itself is part of a propaganda war amongst people. And I'm intrigued with that because Steve Bannon's of the world, I mean, when you look at the Trump administration's obvious use of sort of propaganda techniques, manipulation, his retweets on his Twitter account, those are still the legacy of D.W. Griffith. There's no question about it. I mean, they're using a lot of the shock tactics that Griffith would use in Birth of a Nation. So how do artists who are involved with climate change give the public better tools to rethink our relationship with nature and to kind of give it a little bit more of a poetic sense?
Well, that's something that we kind of mentioned a little bit when we pay our tribute to Paul Lirio, which you will call. In other words, we remember how Paul, who I met, I think, years ago through Sylvain Lochinget, and we one time on, and yes, we own to Paul analysis of speed being the deployment or mobilization of power, which is something that Trump understands very well. He tweets so many times a day. People get so, easy analyzing one tweet, and he's already moved on to the next 20. And that's how far we're behind him. But that's another subject altogether. Let's focus a little bit here, which I want to hear more about your idea of rhythm science, Paul. I want to ask you what that is for all of us, really.
Okay. Can you go to the next slide? Okay. So this is when you talk about rhythm science, this is, I'm going to tie this in. This is a project I produced with the Library of Congress and Martin Scorsese's Foundation for Kino Lorber. So Rhythm Science was my first book. I'm not going to show you the cover. Anyone who wants to look it up, Rhythm Science, it's online. But it won a lot of awards and so on. But the pioneers of African-American cinema ties into that because it was the first time I really got to go deep into the archive. Literally, I visited Library of Congress in Culpeper. They have a huge building that actually has every major film and book ever written in America. And it's all in this crazy bunker. You have to go down and they keep it temperature controlled and you have to wear like crazy gear. So that's like archive fever. That's a rhythm science, being able to go into the archive. That's very Virilio, Derrida, all the sort of French philosophers of, I'd say, the late 20th century. Everybody was trying to figure out the archive. So pioneers of African-American cinema, that was a project I produced as executive producer. But I've always been fascinated with how film, especially how you edit sequences, influences people from so many different angles. So we got the first films ever made by African-American directors, did high definition print transfers, cleaned it up. And it's on Netflix as well. It's been really popular in that form. So Rhythm Science, like I was saying earlier, my first book, I was trying to figure out a collision between design by DJ. And the fun part about design, always you have to think about forms and structures, whether you're designing a chair, whether you're designing, the architecture of a building, you name it, it's all pattern recognition. Yeah. And pattern recognition means you're being able to kind of think of what is a structure, whether it be a structure in sound or even a thought structure. There's a very famous term Wagner coined called Gesamtkunstwerk. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is Wagner. Most people, we all know he was sort of a racist asshole, anti-Semite, misogynist, crazy dude. That's one of my portraits of him. On the other end of the spectrum, he did coin the term Gesamtkunstwerk, which is, I think, the defining term of our time right now, because it simply means, for those who don't speak German, it just means total artwork. And his series of essays about music and graphics, because he actually designed the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth. It's a beautiful opera house. So he was looking at the intersection of architecture, music, and he was very clever with how he cultivated the arts and patronage system of the time. Yeah. So I was artist in residence in Bayreuth for a while and was really intrigued with, he was also, amusingly enough, his relationship with Friedrich Nietzsche. And, you know, so Nietzsche and him had a huge fallout. And so they both ended up writing a series of essays about music and philosophy to sort of counter each other. And if the amusing of this trajectory goes pretty wild, because in a toxic way, both of them became Hitler's favorite artists. Nietzsche was Hitler's favorite philosopher, and Wagner was his favorite composer. Now, the manipulation of public opinion during the Third Reich, there's so many legacies of how people thought about, if you look at Soviet realism, if you look at what happened after the the Cold War, the US and the Soviets got into a huge graphic design war. But the CIA would sponsor jazz concerts, for example, like Charlie Parker, Duke Ellington, to counter Soviet realism. And actually, you know, even artists like Jackson Pollock, for example, were also part of what the CIA was using to create more of a cultural dynamic against the Soviet model. But they both took from the Germans from World War II. So it's kind of eerily like reverse engineering those tools. So it's the design of public perception. Anyway, still goes a lot of it still goes back to Wagner.
It's interesting because, believe it or not, Verdi also had the same birthday as Wagner, sometime in May.
Okay.
No, another pair is Bach, and a French composer who will come to me in a minute. But the point I'm saying about, a little complicated with Nietzsche, because a lot of that had to do with Elizabeth, his younger sister. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's hard to tell how accurate that is, but I'm dying to hear what Timothy had to say, because all of that go back to Romanticism, you know, the philosophy of idealism and idealist philosophy, you know, in that period, really, which he wrote his doctoral thesis, which I hope that we talk to him more about that, because what Timothy is doing is very important at this time. But go back on what you were commenting about the CIA, Paul. What I learned years ago was that the CIA was created in the same month, believe it or not, sometime in 49 or so, when Suburb America was created. So, you know, for middle-class America, or welcoming the you know, GI coming back from the war, and that model, and how the idea of suburb was created. But as for CIA, at home, it was censoring everybody, left to right.
Yeah, but definitely.
Internationally, it was promoting America, so it's a two-headed monster. You know, we know that. What is my next question? Maybe I'm being the most inadequate technological person.
Okay.
Well, I'm serious. What is your imagining app? Because you're able to create music out of everything, out of Lindo, out of iPhone. Tell me more about that.
Okay. So, by the way, Timothy Morton's book, Hyper Objects, I find it a very refreshing, it's a really sharp book about philosophy and nature. So, amusingly, me and him have a similar cover to our books. Mine came out before, just saying. But I'm a huge Timothy fan. So, can we go to the next slide? So, Phong, the next slide sort of gives you a sense. All right, so this is the Italian Futurist from 1915. Anybody who knows about the arts, they actually wanted to do portraits of cities in sound. So that's considered generally to be one of the first sound systems. Amusingly enough, this is also 1915. Luigi Russolo wrote the book, Arte del Rumore, The Art of Noise. Yes. So the fun part about thinking about sound, noise, complex signals, and apps, amusingly enough, apps are just a math equation. So anyone out there who does code, you can easily think about code and design and still go back to the legacy of the futurist, because they felt that they'd be able to dematerialize all aspects of the personal experience, and use patterns of sound to define everything. Yeah. Now, like we were talking about earlier, pattern recognition is a basic algorithmic process. So that's where you tie sound, art, and visuals together, because they're all patterns. So when you were asking about my book, The Imaginary App, that's on MIT Press. And again, anybody out there, the books I'm mentioning, one is called The Book of Ice. The other is called The Imaginary App. The other is called Sound Unbound. And of course, as Phong had mentioned earlier, Rhythm Science. Most of my books are with MIT Press. And basically, when you're talking about interdisciplinary culture right now, the fascinating thing is that we had such a huge proliferation of tools that most artists, on one hand, I'd say in the late 90s, early 2000s, people were in this transitional moment where the evolution of tools had not translated into market forces. So most collectors, people dealing with sound, one of the most cutting edge artists for that obviously was Namjoon Paik with his major installations and so on. But I still go back to stuff like Joseph Beuys and his idea of social sculpture, which is, I think, the internet now. The entire internet is a huge social sculpture. So when you're talking about, because I can make music from all these devices, it's because memory has gotten cheaper. And most devices now have a serious amount of programming and computational power that has democratized everything. That doesn't mean it's good or bad. It just means that everyone has access to tools that even in another era would have been very expensive, very prohibitive. And the wall of barrier to entry would take, something like, forget what Malcolm Gladwell is saying with 10,000 hours of mastery, like to become a virtuoso. Malcolm Gladwell had this theory that you have to play a violin for 10,000 hours. I could just sample it. So, so all of those kinds of things, they're now at the fingertips of the average kid growing up with, again, this sort of hyper archived. And again, to go to Timothy Morton's concept of hyper objects, we can all think of this as a huge social experiment with density. Because your average person today consumes more information than someone would have consumed in their entire lifetime. And I'm talking like the gigabytes on your phone, the Netflix, the YouTube, the Instagram, all of which would have taken a tremendous amount of knowledge and research to find any of those variables and then make art out of it. Would be almost any of those mediums could be one artist's entire lifetime. So the density of our current moment is something I kind of riff on in my book, The Imaginary App. But I also, I make albums, and I actually have made apps. So my most famous one was a DJ Mixer app, and we had about 15 million downloads of that. So, so these are things that are still, to me at least, part of the art narrative, but they're not part of the normal, I'm going to use again air quotes, normal art world, where usually it's just curators going to art fairs, or they sort of built a small group of their clique or whatever, and then they go to the smaller, more narrow bandwidth kind of stuff. This is more broad brushstroke kind of approach, but at the same time, it uses tools that have huge implications in digital culture. So that's why I thought the futurist slide would work as a kind of a metaphor for that. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is one of my current portraits of the American flag. It's inspired as much by David Hammond's Black Flag as it is by Rauschenberg and various others. But the other day when I was thinking about this idea of hitting the reset button on democracy right now, because this virus stuff, I mean, it's really fascinating to see how social space is so quickly changed, and then also so quickly and eerily, people are like, I'll give you a fun example, Phong. I think me and you texted about it. DJ D Nice had an Instagram party over the weekend where he had hundreds of thousands of people tuning in on Instagram. And he called the Quarantine Club. And so people then started posting TikToks of them dancing around their space because most people are trapped at home. And then in China, there's been a movement now for TikTok comedy about coronavirus comedy, which I've been looking at some of the Chinese feeds out of Taiwan and out of Wuhan, Beijing. And it's been fascinating to see how this, again, the localization of self, because the network systems, on one hand, it's a paradox. Like you have access to worldwide information, worldwide systems, but for the most part, Americans in a Trump demographic are barely engaging with stuff that you would be shocked. I mean, they can't, again, that suspension of disbelief, it's part of theater and reality TV. Anyway, that's what I thought this flag piece would be about. But let's riff a little more, because we've talked about social space, and that's what we're kind of riffing on. What are your thoughts, though, especially after, remember when we hosted the Virilio memorial, Paul Virilio's idea of speed. Now this is it. I mean, we're living in that. Do you have any, what do you think?
Well, I think that I once had the privilege, long dinner with Richard Rorty before he died, you know, the early 90s. And we, you know, I'm convinced that it's time for smart people who have been in academia to be political activists, like we experienced that in the late 60s. Somehow all of that forum need to redeploy at the moment, and in every way that we can organize it, we will. Like right now, we're doing this with you, with all of our friends here. The idea of migration, the idea of distribution, and how we can share what we do, Paul, art, philosophy, science, all of it together as one potential unity, so that we communicate in the same level, same clarity, same, I would say, simple language, so that everyone can understand what we are talking about. You know, I think the day in which in graduate seminar talking about amazing academic language, reading from text, can't be really useful at the moment. You know, so that's why I'm eager to see whether Timothy, who can join us a little bit in a few minutes or so. But that's my urgency right now for people to be able to understand what we're doing in a way. They look towards us in some way, you know. Artists, philosophers, individuals are innately built in with a way to mobilize and make it useful of our solitude. We need our solitude to recreate. So most people, business sector or political sector or whoever else among our fellow human beings are at home right now. They don't know how to deal with that solitude. So it's our job at the moment, our duty, to provide that platform so we can at once, finally communicate with them, you know?
Well, you mentioned earlier, I want to riff on that for a second with you, because the gap between class structures right now and digital divide, I'm using it, that's been bridged. And I really think that more and more people, the next couple billion people that come online are going to be carrying a legacy that actually is a very different legacy of people who've been online for decades. I mean, I've been, like, don't forget, by the way, 2019, last year was the 50th anniversary of the internet. And I met the gentleman who wrote the major source code for packet switching, which allows us to be able to have all these things going like YouTube and so on. His name's Dr. Leonard Kleinrock, and he's based in UCLA. But he did a film with Werner Herzog called Lo and Behold. And so Werner Herzog is one of my favorite documentary filmmakers. So there's a very famous scene in the beginning of the movie where the camera pans, and it's Dr. Leonard Kleinrock walking up to this weird router. It's the first router literally ever on the internet. And they have a room dedicated to it at UCLA. So I visited that room, and me and him were talking about it and kind of showing me around. And it was kind of funny because most people don't realize how the legacy of like ARPANET comes out of both military industrial complex plus with a dash of support for radical innovation. And the fun part about the web now, as it comes out of 1989, Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this one is just kind of a Japanese manga that I thought was kind of a funny thing of just kind of the sense of humor about the politics of code right now and the legacy of all of these platform wars. I mean, whether it be YouTube, whether it be Google, whether it be Facebook, these are all things that are shaping the public discourse. In fact, one could argue 2016 was the Facebook election because of the way all the manipulation, Cambridge Analytica, I'm sure many of us can be aware, the algorithmic manipulation of public perception, whereas 2020 now is going to be the meme election. So more and more people are using memes, GIFs, all sorts of stuff that just consistently is being used by bots, and that those bots on whatever major platform, Instagram, Facebook, yada, yada, I'm intrigued by that. So that's my next book. My next book is called Digital Fiction, The Future of Storytelling. So Phong, I think when you were just talking about how artists use tools right now, we have to, I mean, one of my favorite critics, and I'm sure you probably have published or worked with, Lucy Lepard, her book, The Dematerialization of the Art Object.
Yes.
This is that time. I mean, we really are living that. So the coronavirus and the self-quarantine issues, it's fascinating because like you've seen a radical, just I'm talking like a week, ever since the real American engagement with it has kicked in, it's radically, people are staying home. And Tribeca, I've never seen the city this quiet. I'm a runner, so I've been going on 15 to 20 mile kind of runs every day, like literally every day until I hurt my knee this weekend. And the gyms have emptied, and the normal people who would normally be out jogging, because I'm an outdoors kind of person, have been flooded with people who normally are in the gyms. And I'm just using that as a sense of humor, because it's like, again, like you see people ghost town, and then if you go into the West Side Highway, everyone's jogging like really intensely. But I'm just using those as kind of fun real life vignettes here. But the slide that I'm having everybody look at right now, the manipulation of public space has been part of the way cinema works for the last century, but that's now migrated to the digital. And that's kind of some of the issues that I'm one of my favorite artists for this critique is, do you know Paulo Cirio's work? Yeah, he did Leaks for All, where he sort of helped hack / promote the dissemination of the Panama Papers.
Yeah.
But so too with WikiLeaks and how that shaped the last election, and the selective use of hackers to weaponize information. Those are things that have really come home to roost. Sorry. Yeah.
Something that I'm very eager. It's been a long, perpetual conversation I have had with my good friend David Levi Strauss on this subject. But just to open up soon, I just want to mention that about Reagan, we shouldn't forget that he was the president of Actors Guild in the 50s that facilitated the blacklist. And he was once a Democrat before turning to Republican. So that's another story altogether. Let's see whether we can take some question here. JC, can you help?
Yes. Paul, thank you so much for joining us and for that super interesting conversation. We had some great people jumping in the chat. I know a couple of them left, but Malvika had a really interesting question about like singularity and kind of openness, the openness of open source. Malvika, do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Can you see me?
Yep.
Oh, dope. Okay. Okay. So first of all, I am super into this talk you've been giving and wanted to thank you so much for coming and doing this with us on a Monday. But my question is sort of with reference to what you were saying with DJ D-Nice and the kind of the quarantine party. I was wondering, like, do you feel like the current moment of societal shock will change or reverse our relationship with the internet and kind of like the dream of connectivity and singularity? So like, for instance, in the media I'm consuming right now, I'm being really reminded of like all the positivity and the openness of how we viewed the internet kind of when I was coming up in the 90s and 2000s, this idea of like just it being this like very open source, like Aaron Swartz kind of connected world that has a kind of that had a kind of a bent of social justice or a bent of just a kind of positivity, which I think we've lost in the last 10 years or so. I think the internet has changed forms, or we've changed the way we imagine it. But I was wondering, do you have any thoughts about how this will change the way we treat the World Wide Web?
Okay, those are a couple nested layers. It's like you just gave me a Matryoshka doll. You know, the Russian doll with a little question inside of a question inside of a question.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can unpack some of that, or take some threads of there. First, the web started as an open source situation, and when Sir Tim Berners-Lee made the web in 1989, he was at CERN in Switzerland. Thank God he was there, because if it had been in a corporate environment, the web, as we know, would be very different. But so too with the beginning of the internet and the web are different. It's like saying one is the building and the other is the structures and rooms in the building. And so there's an architectural reference point I'm using here. But the web now, many people are now saying it's Web 2 or 3.0. I mean, I'm not even sure if people realize how 1989 was also a great year in hip hop too. You have BDP, Tribe Called Quest, even the Beastie Boys. I don't know if millennials remember those, but they're really classic hip hop stuff. So when you're talking about the web now, it's the way that code is now sort of, it's like there's a very famous book or short story called The Map by Borges. Is it The Map? I always forget the exact title, where this one guy commissions a map, an emperor commissions a map of his territory. Phong, you remember the title of it? Is it The Map?
No, it's a labyrinth.
The labyrinth, yeah. And so by the time the guy finishes the map has actually just covered the entire world. And then so the web has now covered the landscapes that we now think of as navigating public space. But that's actually quite a good sense of poetry. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is Antonio Gramsci, and I think this might really resonate with what you were asking. And I love this quote from Antonio Gramsci. It says, "The challenge of modernity is to live without illusions and without becoming disillusioned." So one could argue the web as it is now, William Gibson has a new book out, which if you haven't read, it's great. It's called Agency. And he says, me and him are going to do something in a little bit. Now, in fact, Phong, I was going to bring him to your dinner party the other night. But, the eerie thing about the web, I'm very into neuromancer, and amusing enough, Malika, this goes back to what you're talking about. There's a science fictional moment going on right now where even the film Blade Runner, which is, again, one of my favorite films when I was a kid, that was set in the year 2020, 2019. And so, it's like, where's our spaceships? Where's our, we should have colonies off world. We should be on Mars or whatever by now. Yeah. But the future isn't what it used to be. That's one of, kind of those pull quotes from kind of a Gibson world, landscape there. But the poetics is that, how do we rethink better ways of using language to give people possibilities that they weren't even aware that they had? I mean, that's where William S. Burroughs and William Gibson kind of overlap. Yeah. And there's actually a book, Malika, I know you're into poetry, so this is a book I'm producing. I don't know if you guys can see it. There might be a glare. It's called The Fall of America by Allen Ginsberg. And it's a collection of his poems about political upheaval. And I'm going to produce that project where we're going to have different poets. So Malika, hey, just mental footnote. We're going to have different poets reinterpret Ginsberg, the collected works, The Fall of America. At the moment, it's like, all this is so new that it's still, it's eerie. I mean, I just can't believe how quickly this stuff changed. But there's another famous phrase called exponential thinking, which is about large scale thinking, because that's the way this virus works. It's one day you have 2 people, then you have 4, then you have 8, then you have 16, so you're going in such a huge amount of people that we actually can also think of the web as well as a kind of an exponential growth engine as well. So these are 2 overlapping phenomena, especially in the way that the language and anxiety and emotional and mental health issues that have come out of the quarantine situation. Those are things that I think are going to generate a lot of different creative responses. And that's why I brought up the D-Nice quarantine party. And if you look online, all these people posted crazy images of them dancing around their apartment or a small room, and thousands of people posted quirky like loops and GIFs of themselves dancing around small spaces. So that's just one metaphor, but I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Yeah. In science, I think that's the one that you're thinking of Borges, or in rigor in science.
On exactitude in science.
That's that's it. Yeah, it's such a great title as well.
Yeah. Let's jump to another question. We had one from Barbara Latanzi. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Let me see if I can unmute Barbara here.
Can you hear me?
Hey, Barbara, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Let's see. Should I hold down my? I'm holding down my. No, okay, that's not it. Wait a second.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna go for it. Hopefully, you'll still be able to hear me. So thank you so much for this whole conversation. Thank you, Paul. I had a question about the role of transgression in art. And I'm not talking about, like what Coco Fusco might say about, fantasies of oppositionality, but, when you talk about we're having a social experiment with density, I wonder if it's not actually more impoverished in a way, right? Because we don't have the full sensorium of experience. And so we have to work through that. So I think that's a related thing to this notion of transgression and radical expression. How do we think about that in this new social experiment with density?
Okay, well, let's think of it from the viewpoint of most people in the industrialized world, now moving towards post-industrialized, have a cell phone, and that cell phone has more computational power than most of the computers of the 20th century. And again, it's going to only get broader and deeper. And so exponential thinking, is kind of a concept where you think about how things spread quickly. So the internet has spread quickly, and the mobile devices are your windows and portals into that. But on the other hand, people don't realize, and again, this is Phong and Timothy, if he's out there, Timothy's book, Hyperobjects, is a great reference point for that. Hyperobjects is about macro level structures. One could argue that what is macro now has become a data-driven sense of subjectivity. And so if you look at most philosophy of the last several centuries, I mean, Rousseau, of course, Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Our motto these days would be like, I compute, therefore I be, and I found it amusing right now because a lot of that is still manipulated by code and platforms. So Facebook is basically a huge surveillance engine. YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, those are all tools, and even, WhatsApp, WeChat, all of those are highly problematic in terms of privacy, surveillance issues. And recently, just seeing how people are turning their entire lives transparent with this whole quarantine thing. And I think, Barbara, this might go to the heart of what you're talking about with transgression, is that there is no there. So people are just trying to figure out how any platform, any code, any sort of definition of the discourse, it still has to require enough common reference points to make that discourse work. So if everyone is like flying around, one of my favorite metaphors, Barbara, and I think this might be to the heart of your question, is have you ever heard the term murmuration, where you'll see an entire flock of birds move in geometric precision, and then they'll turn on a dime, and they're maybe able to move very quickly. And there's a rigorous mathematics to flock. It's called flocking. So most social media is about flocking, like people, trending and other things. You might as well just think of that. But if you've ever seen a flock of birds, imagine one bird leaving the flock and going in a radically different direction, and the rest of the flock is like, what the hell? He's breaking the code. That's kind of the issue at hand right now. I'm just kind of using it as a metaphor, but my favorite is when you see huge swarms of birds, and they are all moving in these incredibly elegant formations, and they all have an intuitive and subconscious relationship to one another, where they're doing social distancing. And if you ever see a flock of birds that's actually eerily, like sometimes near sunset, if you're out in the countryside, you'll see huge flocks of birds doing crazy geometric flights. And that's basically social distancing, and it's an algorithmic and mathematical process. And anyway, just breaking the code. There we go. Yep.
I appreciate Barbara's question, because I just reminded by a wonderful thing that Toni Morrison says. He say, if you surrender to the wind, you ride with it. And that's something that we're not really doing enough in the academic context or in our cultural, global sense too. Structuring academia in that way is not really that useful sometimes because, like how we've been able to do with the rail, for example, 19 years, this October will be 20th year, we never had a mission statement. Mm-hmm. We never cared for who we're trying to reach. Because I think America thrive on that clarity, that mission statement. What is your philosophy? What is your goal? What is you this and you that? I think that model, I hate to use that word, is not applicable to where we are now in a way. Mm-hmm. I mean, the flock-in system is a good digression. I think that's where we are now. It's what Hakim call temporary autonomous zone. How do we activate that space in between? I mean, I came from Vietnam, so I know how we managed to defeat the French, how we managed to do the same with the Mongol. We didn't tell them we were doing. It's a guerrilla welfare mentality, and that somehow should be applied in artistic practice. Does that make sense, Barbara?
This idea of the temporary autonomous zone, of course, I love that idea. But I'm also thinking about actually something that Manuel de Landa talked. I heard a statement of his. I think it's just in one of his lectures on YouTube about whenever he goes to sleep and he realizes he's in a dream, he tries to do something illegal because that's his chance, right? Like that. So that notion of kind of the radical imagination, how does that express itself? And of course, I love that idea of flocking, as a metaphor for how we kind of move through this new space, how we explore this new space, and that we can't be afraid, right? Like, if we find ourselves in the front, is anyone going to be behind us? Or if we find ourselves behind, if we're not still part of a formation that has emerged that we can productively explore new experiences, right? Mm-hmm. I'm interested in new experiences.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, so Phong, I mean, let's unpack that, Barbara, because when you said temporary autonomous zone, by the way, for people out there, that's written by Hakim Bey, who was it was on Sylvain Létranger's semiotext years ago, which was it's a classic group of books. He was at Columbia University doing a great, really, really good series. I regret, semiotext is one of those classics. So there's kind of semi-retired now, but if you ever, those are collector's items if you ever can find them. But the eerie thing about our moment is that we are in the uncanny. And I'm going back to that kind of Sigmund Freud approach. There's a very famous moment where he wrote a series about the urban landscape and psychology, which again, Freud is obviously problematic, but it's still a good concept, the uncanny, the German term's unheimlich. So he was walking around Venice and kept getting lost. And then he realized that the streets were curving in on themselves and, he would get lost and he'd circle back. So he finally sat down and wrote an essay called, the uncanny. And so for us, at least, the notion of what is human, like if you encounter a bot online and you're not sure if it's human, that's uncanny. Or if you think of a robot that looks a little too human or a little too weird, then that's quote unquote uncanny. So that uncanniness is like now over the entire digital discourse. Like to me, Trump is just Russian malware. He's just basically like taken over and infected the computers of everyone with, terrible reality TV game show host lunatic. And again, it's very Philip K. Dick as well, come to think of it. But how we look at transgression, how we look at changing the narrative means we have to switch the variables. We have to change the patterns, change the equation, all of which is doable. It just is a more matter of, again, pattern recognition, understanding patterns in media, and I'm a huge fan of Manuel de Landa as well. But in the 90s, I really cut my teeth on Deleuze and Guattari, and the idea of machinic approach to sound, and so sort of Deleuzian approach, what they call rhizomes, networks, systems. That's the internet. So it's a perfect time for resonating with that, and it's a perfect time to change the patterns. I firmly believe we could all wake up tomorrow and our credit cards don't work. We walk out in the street, the electricity is going to be off. Who knows? And this is going to be, it's going to get deeper and weirder as the virus radically changes our relationship to sort of capitalism itself. And speaking of which, can we switch to the next slide? And Barbara, hopefully that answered the question, but capitalism and the end of the world, or reimagining the end of capitalism as the end of social space is, so this is a very famous quote from Richard Dawkins, where he says simply, science is the poetry of reality. And I think we can all change the poetics by changing the terms of the discussion. So that's my take on coronavirus era, art and beyond. Hopefully that could,
Hey.
Oh, Timothy's there with us still.
Hey, Phong, can I jump in really quick? We're at the top of the hour, so this is usually when we go to poems and close it down. I know we have a bunch of questions we didn't get to. Obviously, if anyone needs to leave, now it's time to leave.
Is Timothy still there with us?
Let me see.
If he's there, I would love for him to join in. Just I'd like to ask him a question.
No, it looks like Timothy had to sign off.
Okay, that's fine. So one more, maybe just one more, and then go to the poetry reading?
Yeah, let's take one more question. Andrew, under the alias Jeff Judge, had a question right at the beginning that I missed. Andrew, do you wanna jump in? Here, I'll unmute you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have to scroll up, sorry. As I forgot. It's actually related to what we were just all discussing. But it had to do with the idea of public space, which some people were talking about, and how can we we're talking about democracy. And I think that, how can we have that when all media platforms that we have at our disposal, like the one we're using right now, or corporatized? And I feel like that was something that was echoed through, but the questions about transgression and also the earlier question too.
Phong, you want to respond for a second, or?
Well, I think that to me it's just being aware. I mean, I think that I remember just seeing this morning from my Weiwei studio. He basically said, "Should an artist be activist today?" For example, it reminded me also of Alan Capro, maybe 64, 65 essay. That basically declares, should artists be the man of the world today? Not to say that being hermetic, making painting in a studio is less, legitimate. It's just equally so. But I think all the way in which to mobilize visual comprehension in the form of artwork, or all the form of artwork, it needs that multitude of one artist to create similarly what is Paul is so good at. You have to learn to be your promoter, you have to learn to mediate different platform, whoever you meet and where you travel to. All of this thing is part of our world, our landscape right now. It's very hard to find that private space to be hermetic and to be in complete solitude, to be able to produce what is meaningful. I mean, I'm sure there will be always people able to mobilize that space very well. Paul and I was talking earlier, it's unfair to ask someone like Ernest Martin to be like Louis Bourgeois, so it's a fox and a hedgehog kind of temperament. I don't know that answered your question, but I'd love to hear what Paul had to say at his last response.
Yeah, at the moment, I'm at a crossroads where I think the notion of moral, kind of a moral crisis in Western society as capitalism encounters the sort of the biological effects of coronavirus, People are being smashed by bills, unexpected. Most Americans live, again, Phong, we were talking about the working class, but at the same time, many blue-collar white Americans, let's be real, vote against their own interest. So I'm intrigued to see, again, that is exactly a function of manipulation, propaganda, right-wing narratives. And so you have vote after vote. One of the things that blew my mind yesterday was the first senator to be diagnosed with coronavirus was Rand Paul, who actually said it was a hoax, and that he voted consistently against Medicare and other support mechanisms. So let's see how that plays out now that he's been diagnosed with coronavirus. So the virus itself is very Burroughsian. William S. Burroughs' most famous phrase, language is a virus. It resonates with this time. But I also feel like with science and better methods of engaging the world around us, that actually means that we can get rid of this kind of the 20th century's legacy of propaganda, which is, again, straight out of Woodrow Wilson, the Commission on Public Information, 101. That's what these Trump rallies are kind of like hillbilly Nuremberg rallies, and the kind of sheer lie after lie after lie that he spouts. And it's incredible that with a quick Google search, you can debunk most of them in just 5 seconds. But the Fox News demographic has been exposed to almost a Soviet level thinking about reality. And the notion of propaganda that still comes out of World War I. Which to me is really shocking how easily you can trace it back to the, the various nation states' use of media to kind of bolster their point. That's now a war with climate change and denial. So then that's a macro level structure. When I say macro, I'm talking like, I wonder if our species will be able to survive this century because hyper-consumerism, the use of all sorts of toxic materials in our environment, and above all, the way viruses then fill in the niche as climate change, affects all the different biomes. So, flooding, storms, earthquakes, you name it, those all have different mitigating effects on viruses and how they change. So I'll go back to the heart of what I think was the question, was like language. So I'll give you a fun example. The term quarantine, which everyone is now using, actually comes out of Venice and Genoa. And amusingly enough, they both had trading empires at a very specific time in the 13th and 14th century. And the Venetians, a ship would pull into the harbor and they wouldn't let anybody get off because they were like, hey, we've had experience with the Black Plague. So you had 40 giorni, meaning basically 40 days. You'd have to stay on your ship. But it actually then reached out and changed the architecture. It changed public space. And above all, it changed public sense of the invisible, because they didn't know how you got a virus back then. And they weren't even aware of a theory of germs, for example. So people weren't sure how it spread. And that left everybody with, an uncanny sense of uncertainty. Like if you're talking to someone, they even called it humors or other miasma or all sorts of crazy. They didn't know how it spread. So everyone was trying to fill in that empty space. And we're at a kind of a similar thing about ideas now. So that's where I was saying this 2020 election is going to be the meme election. And it's going to get deeper and weirder. And I really don't know what the next phases of this is going to be, because the intersection of the virus, geopolitics, and above all, the notion of truth. Like every nation state's making up a new narrative. Everybody's trying to, the Chinese are suppressing a lot of information. The Americans definitely are. In Europe. But meanwhile, it's hard to argue with the virus because the virus doesn't care. It just needs to propagate. It's going to get, right now, this is just the beginning of a conversation, and I'd love to circle back after another month of quarantine. Because
we'll have you as a host.
Okay.
So thank you. Let's see. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone. Why don't we end with our poetry reading?
Yeah, Malvika, you're the poet today, right?
I think it's me. Yeah.
Okay, one sec. So today's poem is The Quiet World by Jeffrey Mcdaniel. It comes from his collection, The Forgiveness Parade. In an effort to get people to look into each other's eyes more, and also to appease the mutes, the government has decided to allot each person exactly 167 words per day. When the phone rings, I put it to my ear without saying hello. In the restaurant, I point at chicken noodle soup. I am adjusting well to the new way. Late at night, I call my long-distance lover, proudly say, I only used 59 today. I saved the rest for you. When she doesn't respond, I know she's used up all her words. So I slowly whisper, I love you, 32 1/3 times. After that, we just sit on the line and listen to each other breathe.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
That was The Quiet World by Jeffrey Mcdaniel.
Thank you again. Beautiful reading. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you tomorrow at 1 p.m. again. And Paul, we'll see you in a week, I think.
Okay. And thanks to guys. I mean, to be continued. Phong, I'll text and get in touch. I'm starving. I'm gonna order in food. No leaving. Or maybe go for a jog. I don't know.
Afternoon.
All right. Bye, everybody.